Sorry.
Recording is now in progress. So thank you all for joining us. This evening is, I suppose, a great joy for me because Sir Graham Watson, who was a member of the European Parliament for our area for some considerable amount of time, I was fortunate to work with while I was in Europe as a representative of the Local Government Association through the European Committee of the Regions. And he was extraordinarily helpful, particularly in relation to some of the work we were doing on diversity, but also because he encouraged. He didn't say, oh, no, we don't want to hear. He said, come and talk, come and we'll listen, come and we'll see what we can do. And it's a great thing to have that in a leader, somebody who listens and doesn't just want to have their own voice heard. So thank you for that, Graham. Graham was a member of the European Parliament from 1994 to 2014, and thereafter joined the Economic and Social Committee. He was the chairman of the Parliament's Committee on Citizens' Rights, on Justice and Home Affairs, later leader of the European Liberal Democrat and Reform Party group, and the first leader of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe group. Later on, he was president of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe party. So he has done his European work as a liberal Democrat and representative of that party and the European aspect that we champion. He has been in recent times both a teaching fellow and a visiting fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School in the School of Global Affairs. And I love this, Graham, you're also a board member of the European Cyclists Federation. I think that is wonderful, especially in a town like Cheltenham, where we try to encourage cycling. So thank you for that. So Graham, if you'd like to say a few words, and then we will ask Pamela to take over. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Flo, and thank you to everyone for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you this evening. I'm sorry that I'm not in Cheltenham in person, but it's good to be able to join you in any case in cyberspace. As Flo said, I had the honor of representing the southwest of England, well, Somerset for 20 years in the European Parliament, and Cheltenham for 15 of them as one of your MEPs. And then when I was dispatched by the wave of nationalism that swept across the country in 2014, the government booted me upstairs into the European Economic and Social Committee, which is probably the nearest equivalent that the European Union has to a House of Lords. It's an advisory body, it can do no damage. Occasionally manages to do a little good. And these days I devote my time mainly to teaching and to pursuing environmental causes, which is why I'm a member of the board of the European Cyclists Federation. But it's great to be with you tonight, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks so much, Sir Graham. We're so glad to see you. As you know, we've spoken earlier, you and I will just talk for just a very brief period of time, because the most important part of this evening is actually when we open the floor, and we're really keen for everyone to be able to ask any questions that they may want to ask themselves direct to you. So this is really just a scene setter. And I've just got a few questions, and then they're the usual typical ones. I mean, for instance, my first question is that when we were talking earlier about what we might cover, you suggested that we could talk about how we can, one, maintain our links with the EU, and two, rejoin. But you also thought that we might be interested in why the UK-EU relationship never really worked as it should have done. And that we might like to take a look at what we can do to ensure that if we rejoin things, if we do rejoin, things will be better. Now, what really leapt off the page when I looked at that was your word "if." You're saying if we rejoin. Well, you're in a room full of unrepentant, old-fashioned Remainers. We assume, even if it's beyond our lifetime, that we will be rejoining. Now, you're using this word if. What do you mean by if?
Well, I think one of the things, Pamela, that the referendum taught us is that while economic and security interests will always set the stage, it is human emotions which determine the script. And what we saw in not just the 6 months leading up to the referendum, but in the 20 years leading up to the referendum, was a very concerted attempt to try to turn human emotions in the United Kingdom against the European project. Now, I think that logic suggests that we will be back in. We are part of Europe geographically, historically, and culturally. I'm not sure at the moment whether when we go back in, we will go back in one piece or in two or in three pieces, but I think it will happen. I'm convinced, however, that it will not happen unless we learn the lessons of the defeat and plan on the basis of however long it takes to get ourselves back in through a concerted campaign to do so. And I think that requires a number of things. You don't win any campaign like this unless you have leaders who command respect, unless you have a cause to motivate your troops, and unless you have weapons that your opponents do not possess. And those are things we're going to have to work on. I'm happy to talk about that later on. I think we are currently, as a country, under the illusion that we can go it alone in the world. I think all of recent history suggests that that is not the case. But what has happened did not happen suddenly. It happened, as I said, over at least a 20-year period. And I think we're unlikely to be able to reverse it very quickly either. It's going to take quite a number of years.
Do you want to speculate on the number of years? Everyone has a different number. You don't need to. I mean, I just think, we all have no idea. But do you have an idea?
I think it's important, Pamela, to understand just how big a break this was in historical terms. What has happened is deeply damaging, probably as damaging to the United Kingdom as 1917 was to Russia, maybe 1933 to Germany. Put this in historical context. What has happened is something that's very rare in British history. I guess in English history, at least, you have to go back to 1649 to find an equivalent, when Cromwell chopped the head off King Charles. And it took 12 years and a military authoritarian government in between before the monarchy was restored. I very much doubt we'll be back in the European Union in less than 12 years. And I would not be at all surprised if it took twice that length of time.
Well, talking about immediate current events, there's a campaign pressure group called the New Europeans, and they have what they call an international advisor. Now, his name is David Keyes, and he lives in Boris Johnson's constituency, talking about heads rolling. He wrote in his local newspaper this week, and that's called the Hillingdon Vision. He wrote that Johnson is, and I quote him, assisting Putin's Russia by dividing Europe with an ultra-hard Brexit, souring the UK's relationship with its closest neighbour, France, and weakening Britain politically. Is this the reason why we think it's going to take so long? Or is it, I feel that we're being deluded if we think a removal of Johnson is going to sort our problems. Let's deal with Johnson first and his effect.
Yes, I would agree with you. I think the problem is not only Boris Johnson. I think if Boris Johnson goes for whatever reason, he will be replaced by somebody else who will be put in power by the same people. The Conservatives have a majority of 80 within the House of Commons, and within the Conservative group, the anti-Europeans, you might say the hard Brexiters, clearly hold sway. So whoever would succeed him would be likely to be either of this type, or at least would be limited in what they can do. You know, I think what we need to do is, first of all, is understand why we are where we are. Some of you may have read a wonderful book by the Irish journalist Fintan O'Toole called Heroic Failures. Heroic Failures looks at Brexit in terms of the psychology that led to it, and I think is a very interesting take on how we got here. I think we need to look ahead at least, and well, let one suppose that we have a general election in 2024 and another general election in 2029. We are going to need at least 10 years of government committed to rejoining to get us back in there. And it might start with rejoining the customs union, or rejoining the customs union and the single market. But we have to build the support for that, because I think that one of the mistakes that we make or tend to make at the moment is to believe that just because a majority of people now think Brexit was a mistake, that somehow means that a majority of people would vote to go back in. And I'm not sure there's any evidence for that at the moment.
Looking more generally, pan-Europe, I know that you cleave to the notion that there needs to be a supranational level of democracy across the continent of Europe. What are you envisaging? What do you see there?
I think one of the failures of the European movement in the United Kingdom was the failure to, first of all, be honest with people about what the European Union was all about. And secondly, to build the case for being a part of more than simply an economic network. The European Union was about free trade within Europe, but it was never only about free trade within Europe. And that was probably one of the things that took me into the Liberal Party as it then was, rather than the Conservative Party, which Ted Heath was running at the time. I think people failed to understand that in the United Kingdom, the extent of the European Union. They knew that Tim Peake had gone into space, but they didn't know that the reason he'd gone into space was because we were part of the European Space Agency. They could enjoy films like The King's Speech or others. They didn't realize that those films came about because they were funded by a European initiative to promote films that are not Hollywood-based. We were involved in all kinds of things of which people had simply no idea. And sadly, we had a media that was not reporting what was really going on behind it. Where I think we might make a case now is convincing our compatriots that they are missing out. There's one thing people never like, is to be missing out on something else that somebody else gets access to. Now, our fellow Europeans are getting access to all kinds of things that we in the United Kingdom no longer have access to. We need to keep rubbing that in and make them believe that something is going on out there which is much wider than an economic project. It's a political project, and it's a political project set up to deal with the supranational challenges that we face. They might be the challenge of climate change linked to energy security. It might be the challenge of internationally organized crime. It might be the challenge of migration. Any of these things that we need to be working together with others to deal with, and we need to be working together in a structured format. That's, I think, the challenge that faces us all at present.
Thank you. I just have one last question before I hand back to Flo. You mentioned to me that you spent the autumn term last year teaching a course called the EU, the UK, and Brexit to postgraduate students in Toronto. Now, some of what you taught them drew on your book, Building a Liberal Europe, which was published in 2010. Thank you, by John Harper. Just hold it up again. Go on. I love looking. It's a good. Yes. There we are. Building a Liberal Europe. Now, essentially, in this, you say that it's about equipping more people to be citizens of anywhere, i.e. global citizens. Now, first of all, what did the students over there think about us and about Brexit? And what is it to be a global citizen?
Well, I think one of the delightful things about teaching in Canada is you are teaching a nation of people who come from everywhere. People in the class I taught were, in terms of ethnic origin, from almost every continent in the world. I don't have an Antipodean, but I had Asians, I had Latin Americans, I had Africans, I had one or two Europeans. And in a sense, I think for people of their age and their level of education, being a global citizen was almost self-evident. It's not self-evident to everybody. And I think what I drew on was the phrase that Theresa May used in her party conference speech in 2016, when she said, people who believe that they are global citizens are citizens of nowhere. And that led to an interesting debate that was kicked off by David Goodhart on Prospect magazine. He wrote a book called The Road to Nowhere. I think essentially we have two kinds of citizens. We have citizens in the United Kingdom who, for reasons of their personal experience, perhaps their family background, perhaps educational experiences, feel reasonably comfortable living anywhere in at least the developed world, even if it means being together with others who speak different languages, who worship different gods, who perhaps eat different kinds of food and so on, and have no problem with people from those countries being around them in their home environment. We also have a lot of people in the country who are not confident or comfortable with that. And I think one of the things we have to do is to start, it goes back to education, education, education. In Canada, I was impressed to see that 53% of all school leavers go on to some form of higher or further education. In the United Kingdom, sadly, it's only just over 40%.
And briefly, what did your students think of us, these global citizens that you were teaching?
I think they thought we were mad. I think they wondered how such a decision could have come about in a world like this. But perhaps they put it down to a kind of, I don't know, I suppose a British exceptionalism.
So Graham, thank you so much. It's been really good to talk to you. And I'm going to now hand back to Flo, and Flo's going to open the floor. And we invite everyone in the room to put your questions in the chat box, or maybe raise your hand and speak. But Flo will now be running the rest of our session. Thank you, Sir Graham.
Thank you, Pamela. Graham, we have a couple of people who've already asked questions, and I have three more. Go to those who've asked. I think if we could ask you to ask your question, please, and then I'm going to go to Nicoletta Comey. So John first.
Hi, I just wonder, given the media climate we exist in, how do we start to change the emotional climate at a more general level than just the people we moan to every day?
It's a very interesting question, John, and you know, it's always difficult to know where to start. One of the things that I think we must do, whatever we feel about the chances of it happening in the near future, or perhaps even of it happening at all, we have to talk about rejoining. We have to be advocates of rejoin. You know, we maybe recognize that Keir Starmer or Ed Davey are not going to come out very strongly on this because of the political bubble in which they have to operate. But the people who persuaded our compatriots to vote to leave the European Union did so by talking for a long, long time about a referendum, and then by starting to build up those. So I think we need people who are advocates of rejoin, at least of rejoining the single market. People who will argue perhaps not only that Brexit was the wrong decision, but that the type of Brexit chosen by the government was about the worst possible, both for Northern Ireland and for the economy of the United Kingdom. And we need to find ways of doing that which deal with the problem that we have a media owned by people like Rupert Murdoch, who have had an agenda to criticize the European Union and to take the United Kingdom out of it, ever since his father lost a lot of money with the abolition of imperial preferences back in the 1970s when we joined the European Union. His father was a big beef and dairy farmer in Australia, and they lost a lot of money, which may explain why Rupert Murdoch is particularly anti-European. But there are others as well. He's not the only one. We need to use every method, whether it is the letters columns in local newspapers, or whether it is platforms provided by twinning associations or platforms in education or whatever. Use every opportunity to advocate the logic of rejoining and to use some of the very, very substantial evidence that is there. To give you one simple example, and you're probably aware of this already, John, but you know, in September and October, which are the last months for which figures are available, our trade in goods was down 11% on a year earlier. That's a cost of £8.5 billion a month, or £100 billion a year. The cost of Brexit in economic terms is 4% of GDP. It's very much what the Office of Budget Responsibility said it would be. The cost of COVID, which is pretty staggering by itself, is only 2% of GDP. And this is going to go on and on. And of course, there are costs in opportunity terms, whether it is to students in the UK who might have wanted to study abroad under the Erasmus programme, or whether it is to UK citizens who might have wanted to journey abroad and are now no longer able to spend more than 90 out of every 180 days in the Schengen zone. All kinds of difficulties are coming up. And I think people are only just beginning to recognize how great those difficulties are. I think, you know, in many ways, we've not really appreciated the full, how can I say this, the full impact of Brexit, yeah.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham. I'm now going to go to Nicoletta Comey, and after Nicoletta, I'll ask Rod Gray to ask his question.
Hi. Now, you've already answered about the emotional climate. Now, personally, I even wrote, I'm not at the moment interested in the if, when we rejoin. Maybe it will happen, but I think it is too early. And I'm afraid that sometimes to insist with some people that, you know, we should have remained, if people are not ready emotionally, they will go against it, unfortunately. So my question would be, how can we get UK people passionate about Europe? What can we do at base level because yes, we can work and sensibilize people on the music problem, how to have a better trade treaty, how to deal with Horizon, but this, I'm afraid, won't touch the base of the electorate, who tomorrow might even give a result on a referendum of 55 to something, which is not really what we want. We want people to be convinced. Otherwise, all the story of the past 20 years before 2014 will go on. So what can we do to make these UK, EU loving neighbors? How can we create this, as we said, emotional climate? You mentioned a structured method. Could you enlarge on the meaning? And it's very basic what I'm asking, but the more I think about it, the less I find the answers. So perhaps you can suggest something very useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicoletta. I think when I talked about structural or structured cooperation, I was really talking about the genius of the European Union, which in the end was to create a habit of communication between governments. It might have been a police officer in one country pursuing a case, ringing up a police officer in another to get some information. It might have been a transport ministry talking to another transport ministry about a particular problem that they had incurred. But it was the structured cooperation of the European Union which achieved far more than the old 19th century concept of diplomacy could ever achieve in bringing Europeans together and in helping us to learn from each other and to exchange best practice and so on. How we get people passionate about Europe again, I genuinely don't know. There's a wonderful poem by G.K. Chesterton called The Silent People. And the chorus line runs something like, smile at us, pay us, pass us, but never quite forget that we are the people of England who have not spoken yet. It's very, very hard to get people passionate about anything, even sometimes about football matches, you know. What I think we have to win is the intellectual case and then give people the sense that they're missing out on something. But that starts actually with regaining the language. I don't know what your experience is, but when I was at school in the 1960s and early 70s, I was taught, and I was not at a private school, I was at a state grammar school. I was taught to think of the United Kingdom automatically as part of Europe. The anti-Europeans managed to establish a language which separated the UK from Europe. You know, people came from Europe or they went to Europe. In my day, they came from the continent or they went to the continent. So let's start winning the language back so that we can get people thinking as if we were part of the European Union. I think that's the kind of area where we have to concentrate.
Thank you very much for that. That was a very interesting answer to an interesting question. Can I ask Rod if he would come in now, please? And after him, Martin.
Thank you. Good evening, Graham. Good evening, everybody. My question is about Britain and its military muscle. We're seeing something in Ukraine now. Britain's involvement. We've had aircraft carriers circumnavigating the globe. Europe's got a nuclear power on its doorstep. Britain is a member of the Anglophone Five Eyes. How do our EU neighbours begin to deal with Britain in its military form?
I think that's a very interesting question, Rod. And to me, one of the surprising things about the Brexit agreement is that we sought no agreement whatever on military cooperation. It would have seemed obvious to many of us for the both the withdrawal agreement and the what was then called a future relationship agreement, which eventually was only called the Trade and Cooperation Agreement because it was only really about trade. It would have seemed obvious for that to have some military or security component, and it did not. And it was almost as if the attitude that the government was taking was that the European Union was some kind of restraint on our foreign policy. The European Union was never a restraint on foreign policy. I mean, Iraq is perhaps the best example of that. But in Iraq, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany took three very different positions. The European Union did not in any way obstruct them from doing so, although at least they talked to each other about the positions they were taking. And it would seem that the UK has a lot to offer to its European neighbours in terms of common interests in the world and common approach to powerful neighbours like Russia or powerful, not so close countries like China. Maybe we can work on that and try to develop a dialogue with other countries which looks at our common security interests. But at the moment, it's not there. Perhaps we should be putting some pressure on the new, I think they're calling it a Parliamentary Partnership Assembly. It's an assembly created under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, whereby a certain number of members of the Westminster Parliament and a certain number of members of the European Parliament meet together on a regular basis. I am told, or I've not read it yet, I've not seen any confirmation, that the list of the UK parliamentarians on that body was published today, and that the chairman will be Sir Oliver Heald. I know that Hilary Benn is on the committee, at least if my information is correct. Baroness Ludford is on the committee, and others. But it certainly seems an obvious area in which we could be seeking to find and, well, let's say to keep channels open, to find common ground with our continental neighbours.
Thank you for that, Graham. Can I ask Martin now to ask his question? And then Jane has made a comment in the chat, which I think I would like her to turn into a question in relation to the latter part of it, if she would. If not, I will happily do so. Can I ask Martin now to have a word?
Hello, thank you for being here and for organising this. This is excellent. The European movement recommend a step-by-step approach to rejoining. Do you support this?
I think there are very interesting discussions going on in the European movement, and I think there is quite a lot of logic saying that if we were able to rejoin first the customs union or the single market, you know, it would help us, put us in a better position to join. I mean, one of the difficulties of rejoining is that although a certain number of things are known, quite a lot of things are unknown. For example, constitutionally, under the European Union's constitution, because of course we famously don't have a written constitution, if we wish to join the European Union now, was not the case back in the 1970s, we would be obliged to join the single currency, we would be obliged to join the Schengen zone, we would be obliged to take part in areas of cooperation, particularly in justice and home affairs, which we chose not to as a member, or we opted out of later on. So we don't know whether, if we were to go back into full membership, quite what full membership would mean, and to what extent we could take public opinion along with us. in, for example, joining the euro. Personally, I would have no problem. I think it's probably a more stable currency than sterling. But I'm not sure that all my compatriots would take that view. You know, I think too, we don't know what the attitude of our continental neighbors would be to any application from the United Kingdom to rejoin. If you recall not so distant history, we were twice prevented by a French veto from joining in the 1960s. It was only on the third attempt that we got in. And I'm not sure that right at the moment, there would be a huge appetite on the continent to let us back in. So I think the idea of doing it by incremental steps is not a bad one.
Does that mean that had we gone for the Norway option, we might be in a better place now? And is that an option?
For example, I mean, the argument that the anti-Europeans used is that that was the worst of all worlds, because although you had access to markets, you had no political say in the decision, in the rules that were set for those markets. The United Kingdom is a large country. You know, it has a fair amount of heft, one way or another. It would have had some say, but that was the argument used. But yes, and you know, there were things that we could have remained in. For example, the Galileo space program, which we were invited to remain part of, and we chose to pull out of. Seems a bit crazy to me, but you know, perhaps even getting back into some of those programs. The Horizon program on scientific cooperation, for example.
Would the Norway option generally have been a fair reflection of the vote in the referendum that happened?
I think that's very difficult to say, because people were not asked what kind of relationship they wanted with the European Union. They were simply asked whether they wished to be in or not. It was a bit of a nonsense. But my guess is that the Norway option would have reflected public opinion more accurately than the very hard Brexit that was chosen, because it seemed to me that most surveys of public opinion suggested that people were happy to be in economic Europe, but weren't quite so happy to be in political Europe. And if you look at what's happening now, the real damage is being felt by a lot of small and medium-sized companies who are now facing terrible, terrible red tape to continue trading with the continent, whether it is to source components for what they produce or what they do, or whether it is to export their final product. And, you know, I think there are certain confidence building measures that the government could be taking now, which would already improve relations. For example, looking for a veterinary agreement, which would facilitate the movement of veterinary products to Northern Ireland. Looking at means of customs facilitation, because it's not only in the United Kingdom that companies have suffered, but many continental companies have lost their markets in the UK. If you're exporting only 5% of your total produce, it's often not worth dealing with the extra customs hassle, particularly since the 1st of January this year, that it involves. You look for markets elsewhere. You know, the idea that we were somehow prevented from finding markets elsewhere because we were in the European Union was always a nonsense. Germany trades 3 times as much with the rest of the world as the United Kingdom does, and yet it's far more solidly anchored within the European Union than we ever were.
Thank you, Graham. I'm going to ask Jane from Gibraltar, I think from Gibraltar, to raise her question, please. Jane. Jane, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Okay, sorry. I've only just run up the stairs. I was in the street starting to watch this and on the bus. My question basically is, how do we challenge the Tory lie? I've just realised there's a typo, that they've got Brexit done. Because you only have to look at Northern Ireland and our situation here in Gibraltar, where we're still in negotiations, to show that it's not done. And they're just left us hanging out to dry.
I think that's absolutely right, Jane. It's not done. We were told that we were coming out because there was too much red tape. The reality is that Brexit has created red tape in spades. We were told that we were coming out in the name of free trade. So in the name of free trade, we left a union which has 50 successful free trade agreements, and Liz Truss has not even been able to get one to get a free trade agreement with the United States of America yet. I think there are lots of things that are happening that we have to hang around the government's neck. All of the promises of Brexit that have been unfulfilled. The fact that the government, in moving responsibility for Brexit from David Frost to Liz Truss, have put it into the category of broader foreign policy rather than European policy, which is going to create problems for the United Kingdom. You know, David Frost, I was never a great fan of, but he created a Brexit opportunities unit in the Cabinet Office rather than in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Maybe they just recognize now that there are no opportunities in Brexit, that it has created a profound and chronic uncertainty in the country. And that's the kind of thing we need to be hammering on and on about. And I think that, you know, Andrew Adonis and his colleagues at the European movement are doing a pretty good job on this. And I'm sure there are others, such as this New Europeans group and so on, that will work with them.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Another comment that was made before I bring you in, John, was in relation to Northern Ireland and Gibraltar and how that is going to pan out. So I'd like you to answer that as a question. Before you do, however, John, you made a comment in relation to demographics. Would you like to speak about the age of those of us involved as pro-Europeans and what we need to do?
Hi, yeah, sorry about that. Just trying to on guard all of the security measures on the phone. So my observation is that generally, I see a lot of people my age, 50s plus, who are active, and it's a question of how do we begin to engage the younger audience. I've been down to the Reading Festival handing out stickers in the past, and there's no traction within that group. It's almost a reliance on us to help bring about. And my fear is that if the suggestions that Sir John made, that it's going to take possibly 20, 25 years, many of us might not be around then to see the fruits of our labor, and we fizzle out.
Well, I hope not. I mean, medical technology within our lifetimes has increased the average lifespan in the developed world by at least 25%. So, you know, we may be around for and pushing leaflets through people's doors and carrying banners on protest marches for many years yet. You know, I've always been surprised with the idea that it's young people who change things. I'm not sure it is. You know, they have a lot of energy for 24 hours. They might even manage to go for a whole night without sleep, but I'm not sure they have the stamina of people who've been at it for rather longer. And I think we're going to need all of that stamina to achieve what we're going to achieve. And a lot of it will be in pointing out to those young people how they are missing out on things that young people on the continent are enjoying. I think one of the things that I just comment on before I come to Northern Ireland and Gibraltar is the 2016 referendum. No, we should not allow the idea to take root that this was in any way a normal democratic experiment. Firstly, because of the fact that people were not really asked what they wanted in terms of what kind of relationship with the European Union. They were simply asked whether they wished to be in or not. But secondly, because the United Kingdom, as we've seen from the excellent work that Carol Cadwallader has done, as we saw from the film The Great Hack, and what we now know about Cambridge Analytica, the United Kingdom was used as a petri dish for social media algorithms, financed by people in the United States who wanted to do the same thing in the US presidential election 5 months later, and in fact succeeded in electing Donald Trump in that. You know, this was not a fair democratic contest. And I think just as we must hang it around the government's neck that it's Boris Johnson's Brexit deal or the government's Brexit deal or the Conservative Party's Brexit deal that has put us into this, at the same time say, well, let's have a fair discussion about what people really want in their relationship with the European Union. And this is felt, as Jane said, particularly in Gibraltar and particularly in Northern Ireland, where Brexit is not a done deal at all. It's not really a done deal within the rest of the United Kingdom because some of the powers that the European Union exercise, like state aid decisions, should, according to some, go back to the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales. And the government's internal market ideas do not support that. It's something that Westminster wants to grab for itself. So I think there's a lot of unfinished business there. The particular difficulty in Northern Ireland is that there are serious problems with empty supermarket shelves, and that in Northern Ireland, you don't need Westminster's approval to have a referendum. It's already there in the Good Friday Agreement that you can have a border poll, if you want to, on reunification. I think if the United Kingdom breaks up, I hope it does not, but if it does, I think Northern Ireland will go first. And I think it will be partly as a result of demographic development. The Catholics have continued to have kids where the Protestants have not, but it will be partly because the Republic does not appear threatening to people in Northern Ireland in the way that it once did. It has become a modern liberal democracy. Indeed, I think if there were concerns about reunification, they might be more in the south than they currently are in the north. But Boris Johnson appears to me, with the kind of Brexit he chose, which Theresa May would not have chosen for that reason, he appears to me to be pushing Northern Ireland out of the United Kingdom. And that may happen with Scotland as well. In the case of Gibraltar, I am delighted that the Gibraltar government had the great foresight to say, well, why can't we stay within the Schengen zone? Because in fact, they have been allowed to stay within the Schengen zone, and it makes excellent sense within the economics of southern Spain. You disagree, Jane? You're on mute.
We're still in the process of negotiating. We're hoping that it's going to happen, but there are still some difficulties because people are worried here about Spanish boots on our soil. But if we can get past the Frontex, that it will be Frontex that are at the side of our border and coast guards, then, and we're hoping it's going to happen. Fabian's working extremely hard because basically it's Gibraltar and Spain, even though it said it's being done under the auspices of the UK and the EU. Luckily for us, it's Fabian, our Chief Minister, doing it, but it hasn't happened yet. We've got transitional agreements for Gibraltarians. We can go over, we have to show our passport now because we can't use our EU ID cards. But we show passport and ID and we don't get stamped. But anybody resident in Gibraltar at the moment that isn't a Gibraltarian is being stamped as we go over. We've got huge difficulties with food, with any animal products. We've got empty shelves in Morrison's. We've got the fridges full of dolls just so that they're not empty. They've put toys in fridges. because we're having to either try and get it by road, or it's coming to Algeciras where there's an inspection point, and then coming on a ferry from Algeciras, 3 miles across the bay, well, no, 2 miles across the bay on a ferry. It's awful. And but if the negotiations don't succeed, we're going to be behind a virtual closed border.
I know something about the situation because I had the honor of representing Gibraltar as well in the European Parliament, and doing some work for the government of Gibraltar afterwards in terms of framing the relationship with the European Union. But I mean, there is no doubt that the kind of Brexit that was chosen has made it very, very difficult for Gibraltar and for Northern Ireland. And this is where I touched on it briefly in my introductory remarks. I am quite worried about the integrity of the United Kingdom in terms of what Brexit is doing, because I think that it has given an impulse to the nationalist cause in Northern Ireland and the nationalist cause in Scotland.
Yeah.
Of course, if both of those go, it's likely that we will have a particular majority in the United Kingdom for a very long time indeed, which I think is really very interesting. I have two people I'm going to call shortly. Anna Beria, if you would like to ask your question, then Adrian, I'm not sure whether you're going to ask it or Stuart's going to ask it, but I'd like to call you after Anna. Anna, please.
Yes, I was listening to Sir Graham talking about the situation in Europe vis-a-vis the Ukraine and Russia, and I was wondering whether the fact that in over 60 years of European economic cooperation and integration, the fact that countries remain so reluctant to share military defense, is it not a sign that deep down they still do not really trust each other?
I think you touch on a very, very interesting question, Anna. I mean, my experience in the European Parliament suggests to me that two countries in the European Union have always had a problem with issues of sovereignty. Now, to me, sovereignty is not about a king or a queen. It's about the capacity that a society has to control or to influence outcomes. And the reason for the European Union has been to allow Europeans collectively, using their collective weight, to have more influence over things that affect them than they would otherwise have had. That has never been a common perception, either in France or in the United Kingdom. It has been in the smaller countries of the European Union, because they know that they're small countries and that they have to work together, as the Benelux countries have for many years, even prior to the formation of the European Economic Community. It's not been a problem in Germany or in Italy either, because both countries are themselves relatively recent federations. I mean, we're talking between 1848 and 1870. Not a long time ago in history, and see the logic of building federations of groups of people. It has been a problem in the UK, and it has been a problem in France. And I remember hearing it said when, well, in fact, he told me, when Jose Manuel Barroso became the president of the European Commission in 2004, he had a phone call from Peter Carrington, who was then Secretary General of NATO. Carrington said, "Congratulations, Jose Manuel. You know, don't you, that you will have only two problems in all of your time head of the Commission?" And Barroso said, "What are they?" Carrington said, "Britain and France." In a sense, he was right, you know. But we have to convince people, and this was where I was coming in talking about Europe being more than a free trade area or more than an economic unit. We need to get the sense that James Joyce sums up so wonderfully in Ulysses, where he talks about forging in the smithy of our souls the conscience of a continent. Because that's what Europe is all about.
Can I ask Adrian, please, to come in? I'm not sure whether you're going to ask it or whether Stuart is, but if you would like to ask it, then please do.
Okay.
And then Martin Griffiths has made another comment, which I'd like to bring him in on. So Adrian first.
Thank you, Flo. And thank you, Graham. I really enjoyed listening to you. And I speak, though, I think is possibly the oldest person on this call. Maybe the one, two I'd compete with, but certainly the north side of 80. And I was obviously a bit disappointed or depressed by your view that it might take 20 or 30 years, perhaps, for us to rejoin the Union. But it seemed to me there were actually a couple of reasons for optimism. The first is the growing polling evidence that people think it's a mistake. And what's surprising about that is not that it's growing, but it's growing despite the fact that the mainstream media repeatedly tells everybody that it's all going very well, despite the fact there's no political leadership, not the Labour Party nor even your own party, that is talking about the need to get closer to Europe. They all seem to have gone completely stum on this. So, but nonetheless, public opinion is shifting and shifting quite significantly. And the other reason for being optimistic, I think somebody already alluded to it, but they were already about 55, I think, looking at them, is that young people are almost overwhelmingly supportive of the European idea. And they get older, they may change, they may become less so. But my guess is that the next generation of people, voters, will look at some bewilderment about people of my age who denied them all the possibilities that lay in the European Union. So I would like to get a little bit of reassurance from you that if I live another 18 years and reach 100, it might be it might be coming into sight.
I think I will have to break all the rules of politics and give you a completely honest answer.
Whoa! Forget it.
No, I never despair. I think a lot of things could happen, which would move the debate forward a lot more quickly. And you know, it's Macmillan's phrase, isn't it, about history being about events, dear boy, events. You know,
yeah.
Who knows what will happen? I mean, for example, if Russia invades Ukraine next week, and we end up fighting a European war or conflict of some kind, that's going to have a big influence on the way European countries regard each other. We're already seeing quite a lot of cooperation going on in terms of the supply of material and ammunition to the Ukraine. Let us suppose, heaven forfend, although I am actually a secret Republican, let us suppose that Her Majesty is taken by the Grim Reaper, as will happen at some time or other. What's that going to do to the United Kingdom and the way in which we perceive the United Kingdom? I mean, is the next in line for the throne going to be accepted in the same way? What does it do in Northern Ireland in particular? I think there are, I simply take these as examples, and I'm not trying to be flippant, but as examples of things that might change public opinion. And, you know, there are things that will happen inevitably that will allow us the opportunity to make a lot of ground politically, in our case, a lot faster than we thought. Equally, things could happen which will mean that we are fighting our way through a thicket, you know, for a long, long time before we actually see any daylight.
Thank you for the very honest answer.
Colleagues, we are running out of time, unfortunately, because this is a really interesting debate and really interesting questions. I was going to bring Martin in because he had a comment, But if you can keep it really brief, Martin, I would be most appreciative.
I think the comment was that, yes, there has to be room for optimism. When people start to travel back into Europe, particularly young people and less young, they will start to see the real impact of Brexit. And it could change very quickly indeed. COVID has hidden things a great deal. And I think there would have been a bigger backlash had it not been for COVID. But it will come and it will happen. And situations do change. I've just done a piece for the bylines, West England bylines, looking at the Dreyfus affair, which was terrible, and the corruption, all the evidence there. It's the same as we've had over the last 5 years. It changed. Dreyfus eventually was freed. The truth did come out. So we must never give up. And to quote Mr. Leonard Cohen very quickly, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So we must keep shining a light. And don't forget to light a candle tonight because it's Holocaust Memorial Day, everybody. Get a candle out there. And thank you very much, Sir Graham, and everybody's organised this. Please keep up the good work, Cheltenham for Europe. It's excellent.
Can I thank everybody for their contribution this evening? We have got quite a number of people who have made comments and asked questions, but we are, I'm afraid, out of time. Graham, delight to see you. Your wisdom, as always, your ability to respond to questions, as always, has been super. Can I thank you for that? And I hope at some point in the future, we will be able to do this in person rather than at the end of a wire. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, Libby, I'm afraid I can't see what that says. Sorry, Lillian. I'm afraid I can't see what that says. I don't know if anybody else can. But thank you all for being here. Hopefully you will join us again in the not too distant future. Keep the light
on for us.
Yes, absolutely. Keep the light on for us. That's a good way to conclude. Graham, again, thank you very much. It's been lovely to see you, lovely to hear you. Thank you for being so keen to answer questions. And thank you, colleagues, for the questions that you've asked. It's been great. And I look forward to our next debate discussion when hopefully things will have moved on and be a little cheerier for those of us who are Europeans now, always have been and always will be. Thank you again, Graham. All the very best to you and Rita and the family. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Keep well and keep optimistic.
Indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, colleagues.